Well, it's a pleasure to welcome to Wilshire this morning a new friend and kindred spirit, Greg Garrett. Greg, thank you so much for being with us. Some of you were with us yesterday when Greg led a seminar on race and film. He comes to this honestly, having written a good bit about it, taught about it. He teaches English at Baylor University, is also a lay minister and preacher in the Episcopal Church. And so we are finding lots of commonality this weekend as well. Greg, thank you for being with us and what you're doing. After this late service today, he'll be with the deacons and fellowship of the ordained and their spouses, talking about the stories we live by and shape us. So yesterday, we were talking about race. It seems providential, Greg, that we should be doing that this weekend.
Yeah, that's right. And thank you so much for having me, and greetings to all of you. So glad to be with you this morning. This is, of course, the one-year anniversary of the rally in Charlottesville last year. And for many of us, it was a shock to see the images, not just the violence, but also the images of hate and white supremacy, because we think, we've come farther than that, and yet here, walking in broad daylight, are neo-Nazis carrying swastikas, and we have to ask ourselves, okay, how did this happen, and what sort of country are we, and what sort of response can we make to this?
Right. So, Greg, what is it in your judgment? I mean, what is it about people that look like you and me that have for so long seemingly needed to have our dignity and power at the expense of other people? What is it about the history of white people in America and maybe in Western civilization that has created this zero-sum game where we can only be strong and powerful if we can make other people inferior and weak?
Yeah, we talked about this yesterday in terms of how race has been depicted in American culture. And we looked at some of the myths and some of the images of race in American film over the last 100 years. And it was startling when we looked back at 1915's Birth of a Nation, which is this startlingly racist, but also incredibly artistic vision of what life in the American South looked like and ought to look like from the standpoint of people in power wanting to hold on to their power. Dr. King used to talk about how people with power don't willingly give up their power. Mm-hmm. There has to be a good reason for that. And just the simple dynamics of it are, if we have power, then we want to hold on to that. We don't want to lose it. We don't want to be the people without power, because we also see what that looks like. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of the things that's going on in our culture right now. When you listen to last year's rallies at Charlottesville, where they're chanting, "You will not replace us."
To the Jews.
To the Jews.
Right.
There is this fear in part of white America that we are being replaced, and America's demographics are changing. And there was a wonderful book that came out recently called The End of White Christian America. And this week on Fox News, a commentator said, "I don't recognize America anymore, and that frightens me."
Right.
And so a lot of this grows out of this fear, which we can understand. Of course, we don't condone it, but we can at least sort of understand where it comes from a little bit.
So yesterday you talked about how stories can either be life-giving or soul-killing. And so the stories of film were yesterday, of course, there's literature, and then there's the gospel story as well. So if stories can be used as kind of propaganda, you might say, to reinforce this, how do stories also get used in order to subvert that and to correct it and to heal us?
We talked a little bit about that both in the seminar yesterday morning, and we had lunch with the residents yesterday, which was such a wonderful thing to get to talk with them and learn from them. And we talked yesterday about claiming those myths that are soul-filling. And when we talk about myth, we said yesterday, we're not talking about, like Greek myth, Hera came full-blown from the brow of Zeus. We know that didn't actually happen. But when we do talk about myth in a useful way, we can say myth is something that helps us understand or think we understand who we are and where we come from. And so some of the myths that we find in Birth of a Nation are myths that have been seized on by people to sort of explain the world to them. This is who we are, this is who we should be, and this is who the other is and where we need to keep the other in order to continue to be who we are. But when we find those myths that are soul-filling, we talked yesterday about Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, the great 1967 film with Sidney Poitier and other great Hollywood stars. And there's a character played by Spencer Tracy who is put face to face with his beliefs, the things that he has said he lives by his whole life, and all of a sudden he has trouble living up to it. And that is a myth that we recognize, because there are times in our lives when we say, I've always said I believe this, and now I'm faced with it, and it is harder to do than I thought. And we have all had that moment, and we watch that story, and we see him overcome that fear and become that person that he has said he is, that he is called to be. And that is a myth very much worth our claiming. When we see transformation in the lives of characters and see that they are capable of more than living tiny lives filled with fear.
There's some beautiful stories, actually, that have been coming out of the year after Charlottesville, in which, people have, like, for example, one of the leaders of the Charlottesville rally has been baptized by an African-American pastor now, and has renounced his role in these hate groups. And there are other stories like this taking place. When we come to church, there is something that the gospel has to say to us about how we are healed from these social ills that become deeply personal, psychological ills as well, that are, just simply put, sin, right? So the transformation of our character is what the church is about, in readying ourselves for being part of the, the community that God is seeking to bring to the world. So when you come to church, Greg, and when people who are here, subjects like this are uncomfortable. Right? I mean, they do disturb us. We wish we didn't have to talk about it, right? But part of coming to church is this sort of commitment to say, everything that God has is good and beautiful, and until I can affirm that, I need still the work of the Holy Spirit to transform me. So when you think of the gospel story's power to transform, how is that unique power in the world that addresses these ills?
Well, when we talk about sin, we usually pair it with death. Sin and death are the powers of the enemy, if you will, however you think about that. And what we are called to is a life of love and forgiveness and an awareness of grace, things that are hard for us to seize on sometimes, but yet are the most powerful forces in the universe. And we experience them here in the stories from the Gospels. We experience them here in Holy Community. We experience them here in beautiful music and transcendence. What happens when we come together makes it possible for us to walk out those back doors and live into lives of grace and love and forgiveness, and to believe that those can be the transformative things that they have been for us here and elsewhere. And I think that is one of the amazing things. The other thing that I think sort of comes up in what you were just saying is that we are called to stand and witness to those things, and to those things that we believe in. And over the last few months, it has become more and more clear to me that for me as a white male, in a person of privilege, I need to stand up and say, it is not okay what I am seeing other white people do in the world. I don't want to even be identified with this. This is not what I believe. This is not the world that I want to live in. And we had a conversation yesterday during the seminar. Someone asked me, what are you finding about people who don't want to talk about race anymore? And I said, well, what I've noticed over the last 2.5 years that I've been leading conversations about it is there are two people who don't want to talk about it. White people who don't want to talk about it because they don't feel like it's a problem or because it's a hard thing to talk about. And people of color who don't want to talk about it anymore because they don't believe it will make any difference. And both of those break my heart.
Well, Wilshire, thank you for the way that you accept the hard conversations and lean into them. There are ways that our church is continually to try to address these matters. We have an advocacy committee in our church led by Susie McLaughlin, and of course our staff minister, of Missions and Advocacy, Heather Mustaine. If you would like to know more about how you can be involved, perhaps with our partnership with Friendship West Baptist Church as well and other activities during the year, please let us know that you'd like to be a part of that. Greg, thank you so much for being with us. We look forward to later this afternoon. Thank you for your work and your Christian commitment.